Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Lookout. Today is Friday, the 18th of August, and it's day 5 of our NorCal lightning bust reporting. I'm joined in the studio here by aspiring video producer Jasper Zuko Lunder. Morning, Jasper. And Jasper's supervising uh, all aspects of production today. So, got milder temperatures today, this morning across the Northern California, some higher humidities. We're tracking a hurricane, believe it or not. I think most of you probably heard of it. Hurricane Hillary. Hurricane Hillary is spinning up off the coast of Baja. And the track right now is projected to kind of come up kind of to the east of Lake Tahoe. But I think, people still don't know exactly what is going to happen with Hillary. Our biggest concern with Hillary is that we might miss out on the precip up here, but get a lot of heavy east winds. Because as this storm moves up, we've seen some forecasts that call for some strong east winds as it passes out to our east. So, as we've talked about before, a lot of the fire effects we get from these lightning fires can be beneficial, but having all this fire on the ground leaves us vulnerable at some point to some real potential major fire spread when we've got a big east wind event. So we're hoping for the best, hoping that we get enough moisture from this hurricane to knock things down before the winds come. But there still seems like there's some uncertainty as to what's going to happen there. Okay, so we're going to jump in here. And we're going to start off, we're going to kind of work our way counterclockwise around, starting in the Trinity Alps with the deep fire up to the head fire. We're going to look at fires up here that are being managed as the Happy Camp Complex. And then we're going to jump over here, look at the SRF complex up on the Smith River, work our way down to Hoopa, and then we'll talk about the Pilot Fire. Pilot Fire is active this morning, and so we're just going to make our way. So starting off with the deep fire. Deep fire spread to the east in the last 24 hours. One thing we've noticed is just that the mapping, once again last night, the infrared plane that flies out of Boise was down for mechanical, I think for maintenance. So mapping's kind of, oftentimes it can run up to 24 hours behind the fire, depending on whether or not you have infrared. One thing I've been noticing looking at some of the reports on some of these fires is these fires are pretty minimally staffed. There's not a lot of resources on these fires. We have to keep in mind there's big fires in Oregon, and there's national competition for resources for things like hotshot crews. So some of these fires, like the Slide Fire, the morning report was only showing 2 hand crews on it. This fire, there's no engines assigned to this fire because there's no roads. So, and they're not, as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of firefighting going on this kind of north and west side. There's some indirect line construction happening to keep the fire from moving to the east, and also they don't want the fire to move down and eventually threaten Weaverville. But right now, we don't have a lot of operational intel coming out of this fire as far as where they've built lines or anything else. We saw some news that they are using mules to pack supplies in. One thing this fire has going for it is looking at the humidities right now, current conditions at 8 a.m., 100% humidity at Lewiston and along over here to Weaverville. So seems like they probably got some rain overnight, 95% humidity down by Willow Creek. And the temperatures right now are trending like 10 degrees lower or more than they were yesterday morning. So that's encouraging. Yesterday sounded like it was going to be the kind of heaviest day, hottest day. And even yesterday, this fire didn't do a lot, all in all, with the suppressive impacts of smoke and not that much wind. So that's good news. We'll come back to this fire throughout the day. If we have anything new, that'll go up on Twitter. So heading up Highway 3 here, up to Scott Valley, Etna, Callahan. We don't have much information on these other fires that are burning. The head fire kind of hogged the spotlight. There are some other fires here, and these are being managed as part of the Happy Camp complex. So if we look at a map of the complex, The Happy Camp complex covers a pretty huge area, pretty much between the Salmon River and Highway 96. It doesn't look like they're... and when we have complexes like this, oftentimes they're based on a forest. So right now there's some adjacent fires to this in the Six Rivers National Forest, but they're not being managed by the Happy Camp complex. When a team comes in, they work for the forest supervisor. And when they build complexes, they like to build them around a ranger district or a forest, but there might be two forests right next to each other, and you oftentimes will get two incident command teams, because incident command team doesn't really want to have to work for two different forest supervisors. It's twice as many meetings, or there's a lot of reasons that it's nice to break things up by an administrative unit. So Happy Camp Complex is kind of a catch-all for the incident command team that came in that's going to manage all the fires basically on this part of the Klamath National Forest. So coming in to look at the head fire here, the heat signatures, we don't have new mapping for this, and the heat signatures aren't showing a lot of growth on this fire in the last 12 hours. So the head fire is burning in here. As we see over in Trinity County, temperatures are running about 10 degrees cooler this morning. We've also got some fairly high humidities here as well, 95, 92, 90% humidity, telling us that it's moist. It's really moist there. There's heavy dew, and that's also going to help suppress fire behavior here on this fire. So these fires closer to Scott Valley don't have very accurate mapping of them. There continues to be a little bit of spread there. They're on top of the hill. With this humidity, it's helping. Also, this area really smokes in. We've been watching the Fort Jones webcam, and you really can't see much going on. Smoke just tends to pack in these canyons. That really helps moderate behavior of the fires. And then in the afternoon, unless we've got kind of really strong winds, even though the inversion lifts and these fires can burn, they're backing. They're on top of a hill. They don't really have anywhere to run to. And so all in all, these fires, they're not in a super dangerous position unless we get really pretty extreme large-scale winds. Showing a few fires here in the Marble Mountains. A lot of this area has just burned so many times in the past 10 years that they're not a real high priority. There's not a lot of worry about them coming out of there. So one of the fires that is more concerning is this one over here by Cottage Grove. And as we said before, Cottage Grove is just kind of a wide spot on Highway 96. We've got the Canyon Fire here, the Elliott Fire. We haven't really heard anything about these little dot fires out here or seen much heat from them. But this one around here, around Cottage Grove, is continuing to burn. And we don't have a lot of specific intel about this. If you're on the Mid-Klamath and you have something to report on these, we're running kind of blind here, just like the fire crews are. But these are concerning, just given that these fires are burning in kind of 10 to 15-year-old burn scars, so they do have fuels available. If they keep backing as they have, that's good news. As we mentioned before, the time since burn is kind of one of those open questions. Some things, like we're seeing over on the head fire, the amount of fine fuels, light fuels in the recent burns is really responsive to humidity and can really moderate fire behavior. But at some point, 10 to 15 years out from fire, you've got ample fuel, and if we get strong winds, these fires could make runs. Another fire that we're a little bit worried about, and that definitely is on the radar of folks living in Orleans, is the Perch Fire. This area hasn't had a fire for quite a while. It burned in 2006. And so 17-year-old burn. And the problem with the Perch Fire is just that Perch Creek has a lot of people living in it. When you come in here to the bottom of Perch Creek, there's a whole community in here. We've done some burning up here with the Watershed Council as part of their prescribed fire events. But when it comes down to it, we've got really steep ground, a fire that's inaccessible, and we're worried about east winds with this hurricane. And so this is kind of definitely one of the fires that right now poses the greatest threat to development anywhere in the Klamath. Orleans is, like as we mentioned before, really strong proactive culture around burning, but we still have Forest Service land that comes right up to the community here, where there just hasn't been opportunities to really establish large-scale footholds against fires like this burning into the area. The mosquito we've been watching, it's definitely it's the largest fire kind of here on this part of the Six Rivers. It sounds like it is being managed by the Six Rivers complex. And it has been, as we've mentioned, backing mainly from a ridgetop type position. But there's a lot of fuel out here. One thing that's interesting on the Klamath and kind of all over northwestern California is that we've got this legacy of massive logging in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a little bit in the 80s. So one thing that we're looking at here on the mosquito is just that when you look at all these white outlines, these are all places that were logged. So this area was logged in 1968. This was logged in 1971. And so what we've got are all these kind of like 50 to 60-year-old plantations that were planted densely with Doug fir, a lot of them. And a lot of them, the plantations haven't had a lot of maintenance over the last 30 or 40 years, meaning they haven't been thinned. So what we've seen oftentimes in fires in the Klamath is that these areas can burn with really high severity because they're just these thickets of trees that are all the same age. But what we also saw in the fires last year on the SRF down in Willow Creek was that a lot of these, where they underburned, it didn't kill the trees. It kind of cleaned up underneath them. One thing about these plantations is that when they're kind of closed canopy, is there's not a lot growing underneath them. So they are dense and they're thick, but there's not a lot of brush or ferns or grass or stuff under them. It's kind of just this packed down like pine, like fir needles. And so one of these questions we've got about kind of using fire on the landscape scale to restore these forests to some balance is like, well, what can we get away with in these thickets? Because when we look at the scale of the Six Rivers National Forest, like there's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of logging units that haven't had a lot of love in the last 40 years. So that's part of this conversation around these fires is, what are they going to do in here? What's going to happen if the wind blows these fires down off the mountain and then they can run with the slope? That's one of those things, for now we've got the benefit of these fires being on top of the mountain, but we're just kind of one big wind event away from these fires getting more terrain influence if they do come off the mountain. All right, so now we're going to run up here to Gasky. Still on the Six Rivers National Forest. That's where all these white lines are. There's a couple small fires out here that are named, but that we don't see any heat from. There's fires that are mapped out here that aren't showing any heat. So going to jump in here to the SRF complex, the Smith River complex. Just for orientation, we've got the town of Gasky down here, Darlingtonia, Patrick Creek. We're not seeing a lot of heat on this Kelly fire that burned adjacent and burned across 199. And it's hard to tell with the satellite heat data. It's kind of fickle. Sometimes, all I'll say is that the mapping on these fires is a little bit, like we said, without the infrared, it's hard for them to get perimeters, and it can be 24 hours behind. So what we see is the holiday fire here, burned pretty aggressively towards Oregon yesterday in the Biscuit Fire scar. These other fires have also spread in the Biscuit Fire scar. One thing that's interesting about this part of the world is that the Smith River is kind of one of the most pristine rivers in California. It's a wild and scenic river, and this whole portion of it is roadless. You can see like some little roads here and there, but like for the most part, this is a designated roadless area. And so it means that they're less excited about dropping with dozer lines and pioneering new roads into this area. These fires are being managed under what we would consider a full suppression strategy. They're not just walking away and letting them to burn, but there's also not a lot of opportunities in some of these fires to get in and go direct. This 20-year-old burn scar of the Biscuit Fire has a lot of brush and grass and dead and down trees. And portions of these fires that I think they're most worried about are the portions that are now burning out of the Biscuit Fire into adjacent areas that haven't had much fire history. We're looking at the maps for this fire. They've got what they call management action points, which is kind of what we call like a trigger point. So we'll pull up those maps and look a little bit at them. So here we've got today's briefing map for the SRF complex. We got the Coral, Diamond, Holiday, and Kelly fires. We got Gasky down here in the bottom, and these orange lines on the map are they call management action points. And so basically, like if the fire crosses this line, which is basically a fork of the Smith River, then that initiates a different course of action. If the fire crosses this line, it may trigger evacuations. I don't have specific information on each management action point, but basically on large fires like this that we expect to grow, we create these kind of lines in the sand, say, okay, if the fire crosses this line, then we contact the sheriff about evacuations and an advisory. If a fire crosses this line, then we start line construction on this other ridge. But these are kind of a longer term strategy of how these are going to burn. And when you see these kind of management action points on the ground, usually it tells you that we expect the fire to burn for a while and that there's kind of a long term strategy that's being developed of how that's going to unfold. But as we mentioned, all this gray on the map is the North Fork Smith, and you see these little cherry stems in here is what we call them, like where there's roads that have been built in the past. But roadless areas generally, get some sort of special management protection where we're, interested in reducing the amount of sediment that's going to go into this pristine river or other things like that. So we'll see how this unfolds. Reburning the Biscuit Fire 20 years later isn't necessarily the worst thing that could happen on this landscape. Okay, so hopping over here by Gasky, we see also that this morning 91% humidity, 89% humidity, 72% humidity. As we mentioned before, especially in the fine fuels of the Biscuit Fire, that humidity recovery is a big deal. It really, it's going to take a couple of hours of drying of direct sun, even if there wasn't smoke hanging in here, for things to dry out enough that they'll even burn in the fine fuels of something like the Biscuit Fire. And temperatures are, 10 to 15 degrees cooler than they were yesterday morning at the same time. You can really see when we talk about fine fuels in the Biscuit Fire, you can just really see what we're talking about here. A lot of grass and brush. Okay, head back down here to Hoopa. This Lone Pine Fire here in Hoopa, it's continued to spread a little bit to the west. On the maps this morning, they've got hand line all the way around this fire, and then mixed hand and road line all the way down here. So this fire is looking pretty good all in all. Like we said, we got a lot of things that are at the whims of what happens here with this hurricane, whether or not we get strong east winds. Strong east winds here that blew this fire across the river would be a bad deal, just because we haven't got a lot of fire history on the other side of the river here. Yeah, there's this side of the Trinity River on the Hoopa Reservation. There's not a lot of recent fire history, so definitely it'd be good if this thing stays on the east side of the river. All right, so to wrap up our tour of the northwest corner of California, a lot of growth here on the 3-9 fire, which I think is pretty much being called the pilot fire as well. And one thing we heard this morning is that this fire is really active this morning, that there wasn't much of an inversion overnight here. So let's just jump in and look at the weather here real quick. So temperatures right now are still fairly low. 67, 62. But I think we'll see that the humidities here are a bit higher, 35, 58 on these ridge tops than they are in the canyons where we've seen some really wet conditions this morning. Let's jump in here and look at the webcams. So this is called the Ball Jesse Cam. This is kind of closer to the coast and it looks east, and it is showing that the pilot fire was active overnight and still active this morning. You can see the smoke hanging down here in the canyons, but you can also see that it's clear on the ridge tops. This is the Wild Frontier cam. This is the one that's closest to Gasky, and you can just see that, we talk a lot about the smoke just hanging in during these lightning busts and really affecting the window of opportunity the fire has to burn intensely. So we got this high humidity, we got the smoke. This is really typical for when we have a lot of smoke, and after we kind of lose our mechanism for the smoke to be cleared out. So wrapping up here on the slide fire, this is Red Bluff out here. This is a slide. There's not a lot of resources on the slide. I think yesterday's report showed 2 crews. This fire is not doing a lot. It's not out, and it's got places it could go, but it really isn't doing a lot the last few days. All right, last thing we want to look at is the ranch fire up here on the lava flows. This fire also, we're seeing some growth between the 2 fires that were mapped, but we really haven't been seeing any major spread on the ranch fire, and this is the one that's kind of in north of Ajamawi. All right, thanks for hanging in there, Zuko. Yay. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up. We'll be watching the hurricane. So and follow our Twitter for kind of more ongoing updates. Also check out the lookout.org. We occasionally post some longer form stuff there. We just reposted an essay there that we did about the campfire and structure destruction in light of the Lahaina disaster, that talks about some of the things that researchers have found about what carries fire through urban environments and the factors that make a difference in whether or not a house will survive. So encourage you to, if you're just discovering us, encourage you to go check out the essays and posts on the Lookout. You'll have to kind of wade through a lot of fire intel posts, but we do have it organized by category. And if you check out the interviews category, we've got some really great conversations we've had with some people that really know the fire business. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for your support.